I'm going to make a quick video here to show Michael how to take the struts off these Chevrolets Cobalt. He says he wants to do it and give it a try on his own. So first thing, tell Michael, of course you got to take off the tire and the wheel, is to jack up the lower control arm and support it, as you see here. I gotta go this way here so the light doesn't shine in. You can see where the jack's underneath the control arm. Support it up enough to take the weight off this control sway bar link. It's hard to say where that point is until you take these nuts loose on the studs, and then you can pretty well move it up and down in order to push it out. These things are really hard to get off sometimes, especially if they've been on the car for a while. These were replaced about a year or so ago and they're not rusted up as much. I know on your car, Michael, the one on the right side was replaced 4, 5, 6 years ago, so I don't know how much rust is on there, but when you take them off you have to put a wrench on here, and you take another small socket, which is a inverted Torx, to hold this side here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's easier to show you what I'm talking about. This is the setup I'm talking about after you get that nut loose off that stud, how you're going to be able to take that nut off that stud. It's not going to be easy. I squirt penetrating oil on them, let them set if they're really rusty. Sometimes you have to cut them off. As you remember, when we took that off, to try to take it off the first time on your car, it was still rusted on, and you had to get the car back to Kansas City, and one of the relatives took it off. I can't remember exactly. They had to cut it off with a torch. If my memory serves me correct, but we couldn't do it here because we didn't have time to get the torch and everything out, or we didn't have the part. I think that's what it was. We had to buy the part first. But regardless of the fact, you could run into that, and these sway bar links are really a pain in the butt to get off sometimes because they get rusted on, and sometimes you just can't wrench them off. So that's one thing I wanted you to alert you about, to get some penetrating oil on them first to see if you can get them off first. And what I do is, and I'll show you, I set up a socket just like anything else and try to impact them off. Then after I get them broke loose a little bit, I set up the wrench like that. It's so dark in here, I gotta get this light so you can see what I'm talking about. I said it was inverted Torx. It's actually an 8mm or 5/16 that goes on the stud to hold it, and then it's an 18mm on the nut. And you can either turn the stud in that goes the opposite way and you hold the wrench, or vice versa. You hold the stud and move the wrench. I usually use ratchet wrenches, but you don't have any, so you just use a regular wrench. This is going to be the hardest part of the whole thing, trying to break these things loose. Because I remember when I put these links on this car here, I can't remember. I think I ended up cutting them off because the nuts just would not come off. So the only one you have to take off on this one is the upper one, and the struts are right here. Now the struts are bolted on to the spindle by these bolts right here, and nuts, and you remove the nuts, and these bolts are spline into the spindle. So you have to remove them by hitting them with a hammer, or I'll show you here in a minute. I'll just take one loose to show you how it works. And the first thing I usually do, and you could do it either way, you can take it loose from the spindle first, or you take the 3 bolts and nuts that are retained from the top of the vehicle, take these off. Then you have to have it supported by the jack underneath on the lower control arm, because this whole thing is going to be loose up here. Then you take these 2 bolts out, then the strut will be completely free. And of course you got to have the sway bar link loose first. Now that sway bar link is going to be under tension. Like I said, you got to move the control arm up and down until you get the tension off the sway bar link, because the other side is it pushes the opposite way. It's like a counterforce. The sway bar keeps the car from swaying when you're going around curves and so forth, because one control arm is up and one control arm is down when you're going around corners, and this kind of keeps the suspension under tension, so it keeps the car under control, if I'm saying that right. So let me show you how I'll take one of these spindle bolts, McPherson strut spindle bolts loose, and show you how they come out. Now how I remove these bolts, I take and put the nut flush with the end of the stud. A lot of people put them on the reverse way, put this side out, but these are locking nuts, and actually this flange here they're kind of made where they bend in, so they put tension against the bolt to keep it in the spindle housing. So if you turn around and hit it on this side, you might just start it and it doesn't do its job. So you don't want to hit on the end of the bolt there, because if you mess up, you could mess up the threads and so forth, and you're buying a new bolt. And I would, if you have to do that, I would suggest to maybe go to the GM dealer, the Chevrolet dealer, and get the proper one for this, because there's a certain hardness. Now they have the hardness marked on the top of the head, but there's certain bolts for this, and you just don't go to the hardware store. You might get the right one, but I strongly suggest get the one that the factory put back in this vehicle if you have to replace these. And it's the same thing with the nut too, because it's a safety thing. What I always do is I take a brass hammer. You have to make sure this nut is out where it's lined up with the face, so you're hitting the stud that's sticking out on the nut too at the same time, and the nut at the same time. And then I take, boy, it's hard to do to hold this camera and hit like this. I'll show you. See how they hit, how they're splined in. You can see the splines. If you can see the splines in there, that's how they're locked into here. You knock it out completely until it backs out all the way. Now, of course, though, when this comes loose, this is going to all be free here, and if you got to have the lower control arm supported by the jack, or else this whole thing's going to fall down, and you don't want that, because you have the brake line here and so forth, and you don't want it overextending itself, because you can mess that up. So get this light turned around. So that's more or less how those bolts come out. Of course, after you get all this loose, that all is free. You know, this sway bar link is going to be away from the free from the strut and so forth. So this is all going to come out. Then this new one, the whole unit will go back into the same way. So to hit these bolts back in, I line them up and just tap them back in. Now, if so happens if yours comes out harder, you can't get them to get loose. What I usually do is take something soft, same way, and then put it on like that, maybe a piece of wood or a 2x4, then take another hammer and put this one up here, then use the big hammer to hit the other side of the brass hammer, or the soft material will knock that out. And all this is softer material than the steel, the bolt and the nut, so you don't mess them up. So after you get it out and get that bolt back far enough, you're going to have to take like a punch and push it out the rest of the way. Sometimes you can take a pair of pliers or something on this side and kind of remove it the rest of the way. But once these splines move free of the spindle, they slide right out. But then again, you're going to have to have tension or a pressure against this lower control arm to keep this spindle up, because otherwise it's going to fall down. I keep repeating myself on that, because you've got to have something. You have to have a jack to support that, and you have to have jack stands underneath the car to support the car. Because anything at all, it slips, then you know what's going to happen. It's not good. It's not worth it. To save the money on something like this, it's not worth it if you get yourself hurt, because you have a family to take care of. You know, I'm starting to say things like when you're 15 years old, but it's just common sense things. So no money saved is worth your health, believe me. So that's about all I can say about this. This is going to be, I'm trying to make this as short as possible, trying to abbreviate things so I can get this uploaded, because our internet connection here isn't the fastest in the world. By the time I get this uploaded and so forth, and I have to take the lower control arms and everything out from this car and do some engine work. So I got to get working on this so I can get this car back to Ruth Ann. Let me show you here the bushings I'm talking about on this that wore out. Now this may or may not be an issue with your car, but it's hard to say. But you take a pry screwdriver, and of course I have the car jacked up a little bit. You can do it with it completely unsupported, but you got to have jack stands underneath it. Of course the tire's off. But let me get closer here. There's the back bushing on the lower control arm, which bolts to the body of the car. You can see how loose it is. It's actually the rubber part is completely separated from the steel part that's in. If I get this closer, let me do it. Those bushings are actually made into the piece of steel there, and the bushing is completely separated from that piece of steel, which fits in the lower control arm. And what's happening, this lower control arm is moving back and forth like this, so which in turn makes the tire and the whole suspension, lower suspension move. When you brake the car jerks and so forth. The other part of the lower control arm is bolted on to the frame right there. You can see underneath the constant velocity, or the axle. It's bolted in the front and the back, which you can't see. Well, whatever. But that bushing there seems to be in pretty good shape. It's dry rotted, but the issues is the same thing on the other side, is worse. Is this back bushing. So this whole thing has to come out, which I'm going to make a video on, but I just wanted to show you here how to get these struts out and show you how to check the lower control arm bushings. And I know this sway bar link was replaced, like I say, 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe longer, but that's something you need to check, and on these GM cars that's a big issue. They wear out real quick. So I don't know, the one on the right side, like I said, was replaced 4 or 5 years ago. That doesn't say it's still in good shape. The left side might be original, so they're not all that expensive. You might consider going ahead and replace them, especially if you can't get them off, and somehow or another you're going to have to cut them to get them off, which you don't have that equipment. Now you say your friend has a shop and tools, maybe he has a torch, because sometimes that's the only way you can get these things off. You just have to cut them right here. You can use a cut saw, or I usually use the torch. You know, when you use a torch, you got to watch it. These struts here are full of gas, and if you get it too hot, they could expand and blow. So you have to know how to use a torch. Cut this off real quick. Now this one down at the bottom is really a pain, because it's right in the way of that lower control arm, and believe me, it's just hard to do sometimes. So, and then again, if you can't get them off, you can just go down there and you cut it off right off with the torch. But this is some of the things you have to be aware of. And I'll show you here to put the nuts back on. You just tighten them up like so. Now you got to torque everything to specs. You know, I never did before, because I pretty well knew how to tighten things, but you got to make sure this stuff is tight. it's not crucial to get a torque wrench on these. Just make sure they're tight. Oh, I'm getting a leg cramp by bending down. And to make sure everything is good and tight when you put everything back up. Now this part here, there's no alignment specs on this. You don't have to mark it. A lot of the cars, that's how they adjust their front wheel alignment camber right here. But on these GM cars, they're just fixed, so you don't have to worry about marking anything. Other than that, that's about all I can think about telling you. It's all up front, but like I say, if you got rusted nuts and bolts, then you got issues. So it's something you have to be aware of. I don't know if that car's got the rust issues or not, if you were in a rust belt more, but I don't think you have that much of a rust issue there. But the car was in Missouri for a while, so there could be an issue there. So hopefully not. So that's about all I can say right now. I'm going to make a video of doing this, and I don't know when I'll get it uploaded and so forth, but this is the main one I wanted to show you. And if you have any more questions, and let me know. And I'm sure there's a lot of YouTube videos on this. It probably does a whole lot better job than me. So talk to you later. Okay, hopefully you can see this. First thing I do is I put some penetrating oil on the threads, and then I take a socket. Of course, I got an impact, and I try to see if it'll break loose, which sometimes it'll break loose and spin, but at least you get the nut loose. Like, well, okay, this one here, since David just got done putting struts on this thing, it's all loose. But that won't ever happen again, believe me, unless he just did this a month or two ago. So what you do is, and you know the nut's going to be locked on here, and if you put penetrating on this stuff and just keep putting oil on there like once a week until up to the point you do this, they may come off. But this is the first one. Of course, I always worked on brand new cars, and most of them just came off like that, but I'll guarantee you that yours won't. So it was an 8mm. Bear with me for a second here. I got to get my tools back out here. And an 18 with a wrench, and hopefully the camera will stay in place. I got it set up on a toolbox. Well, I don't see how these YouTube guys do this. Of course, they got all kinds of fixtures and stuff to put their cameras on. I'm tightening this thing back up to make you, like if it was tight, you can't get it loose. So you have to hold it on this side here, and you pull it down there, and you can turn it in like this, or else hold it here and wrench it off like this. Now I have ratchet wrenches, but you know that you don't. I know you don't have them, but you can do either way. Most of the time, you have to hold it with this on the 8mm side on the stud, and pull it down with the 18mm, and it's like I say, about a quarter turn each time. It's really hard to get off. And like I say, the more you put penetrating oil on this and dissolve that rust, the better off you're going to be. It's the only thing I can say. And like I have most of the time on these older cars, or not even older than a GM car, when they get a year or two old, they really rust. You have to cut them off. So hopefully that won't be an issue with yours. That lower one is really hard. I have to get underneath the car to do them. And you have to make sure the car's jacked up and supported correctly if you get underneath the car. And to tighten them up, it's just the opposite way. Of course, I'm using an impact here, but you tighten up with a wrench and make sure it's good and tight. And that's the only one you have to take off unless these things are bad and you got to take both sides off.